we've kicked the tires on the early date reading of 1 Kings 6:1 and tested the consistency of Amenhotep II as Pharaoh of the Exodus. But supporters of the view are nothing if not determined. Find out their best counter-arguments today on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. This is the last video in our series on the early date view of the Exodus. Please consider watching the previous videos before watching this one. And if you like these videos, hit the subscribe button and consider supporting the channel financially by Patreon or purchasing a copy of my forthcoming book, affiliate link below. Today, we are going to cover the best 3 counter-arguments for the early Exodus date. The supporters of this view use these arguments as proofs for their reading of 1 Kings 6:1, which we have covered in previous videos. Argument number 1, Jephthah's speech in Judges 11:26. Jephthah says in a speech to King Sihon, "While Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and in Arar and its villages, and in all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years, why did you not recover them within that time?" According to Scott Stripling, scholars agree that Jephthah lived around 1100 BC, and 300 years is an approximate. So according to them, we have a second way to determine the entry of Israel into Canaan around 1400 BC. Then add 40 years for the wilderness, and you have sometime in the 1440s for the Exodus. Scott Stripling's statement that scholars agree that Japheth lived around 1100 BC is vastly overstated and a bit disingenuous. Most scholars who still believe in the Bible believe in the late Exodus date, and that the period of the conquest/judges was from circa 1220 BC until around 1160 BC. By saying that Jephthah lived around 1100 BC, they are splitting the difference between 1220 and 1060 and rounding to the nearest century. No one has independently dated Jephthah, and there is no universal agreement on the date. But it is ironic that Stripling is using a late date Exodus dating to prove an early date. However, that's not the only issue with Jephthah's speech. The other issue is the content of his speech. Practically everything Jephthah says in his speech is wrong. Chemosh was not the god of the Amorites, but of the Moabites. Chemosh did not give Amorite land to the Amorites, in verse 24. It is the Lord who gave the land to the Amorites, just as the Lord gave to every nation their land, Deuteronomy 32:8. The purpose of this passage is to show just how ignorant Jephthah was as the son of a harlot, verse 1. So can we trust the 300 years spoken by Jephthah when everything else he said was wrong? Argument 2. Ezekiel 41, the Seder alone, and the 16 Jubilee cycles. The next argument is one of the early daters hit it out of the ballpark arguments. And I will admit that it is difficult to engage because Talmudic literature is often difficult and obscure. This argument originates with Roger Young, who published the only version of it in the Westminster Theological Journal in 2006. In this article, Young uses the Seder Olam Rabbah to provide an independent basis for the 1446 BC date of the Exodus. The Seder Olam Rabbah is part of the Babylonian Talmud, which was compiled and published around 500 AD. Now, The problem with taking the Seder Olam at face value is that there are places where the Talmud exaggerates or resorts to legends and contradictory accounts. Would we accept an oral tradition about Jesus Christ that was first committed to paper during the Dark Ages? Probably not. And almost nobody credible takes for given an oral tradition that is 1,000 years old. But let's give the source the benefit of the doubt for the moment and examine the argument itself. Roger Young states that the Seder alone in Ezekiel 12a shows that the vision in Ezekiel 40 verse 1 occurred in a Jubilee year because Rosh Hashanah, that's the Israelite New Year, occurred on the 10th of the month. Young also states that the numbering of the Jubilee is the 17th as found in Ezekiel 12b. From this, Young calculates that Ezekiel's Jubilee took place in 574 BC. He takes the Talmud to state that Ezekiel's Jubilee was the 17th Jubilee. According to Young, the 16th Jubilee cycle began in 622 BC. 16 Jubilee cycles of 49 years equals 784 years, which, when added to 622 BC, equals 1406 BC, the year the early Israelite conquest begins. They add 40 years to this and get 1446 BC for the early date of the Exodus, which just so happens to equate to the 480 in 1 Kings 6:1 when added to the 4th year of Solomon, 967 BC. But what does Ezekiel 12b actually say? Let's go back to the primary sources and find out. The text reads, Rabbi Yehuda says, for the first time the temple was destroyed, you do not find a teaching that there were 17 Jubilees from when Israel entered into Israel until they left. So you cannot say that they entered from that time. Because if you did, it means that the temple was destroyed at the beginning of a Jubilee. But do you not find that in the 14th year after the city was smitten? Ezekiel 40 verse 1. However, this passage works against Young's argument. On the one hand, if the statement is saying that 17 Jubilees took place between the Israelite conquest and the destruction of Jerusalem, then 17 cycles of 49 years plus 35 years took place before the destruction. This means the Talmud actually infers that Ezekiel's Jubilee was the 18th, not the 17th Jubilee. So at the very least, Young's count is off by at least 49 years. On the other hand, the passage is not actually saying that there were 17 Jubilee cycles. The passage is about two rabbis squabbling about the year of the temple's destruction. Rabbi Yehuda says there is no 17-year teaching because, if there were, it would mean the destruction of the temple would fall on a Jubilee year. The second rabbi says that's not the reason there's no teaching. Because the Jubilee year was the 14th year after the temple was destroyed. Neither rabbi is actually saying that there is a 17 Jubilee cycle teaching that originated from the rabbis. But if the Talmud is not saying that there were 17 Jubilee cycles between Ezekiel 40, really the fall of the city, and the Israelite conquest, is there any other basis for Young's 17 Jubilee cycles? The short answer is no. Argument 3. the 19 generations of 1 Chronicles 6, 33 to 37. The final counter-argument we are going to look at is 1 Chronicles 6, 33 to 37. Now, this passage is really interesting for me because it involves genealogies. Genealogies are an untapped resource that is full of interesting data. And unfortunately, most Western readers of the Bible just aren't clued in to how rich a source this is. Now, the argument used by the early date supporters here is that 18 generations occurred from Heman, contemporary with King David, to Moses. So according to them, you add one more generation for Solomon's generation and you get 19 generations. Assuming that a generation is 25 years, 19 multiplied by 25 gets you 475, which is pretty darn close to 480 years, i.e. the 480 years of 1 Kings 6:1. But is this further proof of an early Exodus date? Well, let's examine the 19 generations between Moses and Solomon in 1 Chronicles 6, 33 to 37. This argument assumes that Korah, the third generation, was contemporary with Moses. And all the generations between Korah and Heman plus 1 took place from the Exodus to the foundation of Solomon's temple. How did they get to Korah being contemporary with Moses? Exodus 6 states the lineage of Moses as Levi to Kohath, Amram to Moses. Thus, the third generation after Levi was Moses' generation. However, there are problems with this reading. Exodus 6:24 states that the sons or grandsons of Korah were Asir, Elkanah, and Ebiasaph, and that these were the clans of the Korahites. This is a very important detail. Now, in the ancient Near East, a clan is a group consisting of 4 generations. This means that at least 4 generations were alive at the same time as Korah. This would mean that several of these generations could have been substantially less than 25 years. Making matters worse, the genealogy in 1 Chronicles 6, 33 to 37 appears to have been copied from Zuph to Elkanah from 1 Samuel 1:1. So Heman is not a descendant of Levi at all, and was actually one of the lineage of the prophet Samuel, known to be from the tribe of Ephraim. 1 Samuel 1:1. Not only are the members of this genealogy unrelated, this also means that the genealogy may not be consecutive at all. Since the chronicler has spliced the genealogies, how much overlapping exists between the spliced portions? Heman is made a Levi according to the chronicler so that he can serve in the temple as a singer. Now, this isn't deceit by the chronicler, since he would have known the source of the genealogy as would the ancient reader. The original readership was acutely aware of genealogical data, much more so than modern readers. So the ancient reader would have instantly recognized that Heman was grandson of Samuel. And the purpose of the genealogy was to create continuity for Samuel's posterity to respect Samuel's service to God in the sanctuary. Samuel already served within the tabernacle, so his family is grandfathered in by making the lineage honorary Levites. Unfortunately, there is just too much happening in this text to be considered a reliable means for establishing any sort of date. But this shows the problem with confirmation bias. One can look through the scriptures to support your beliefs, only to find them contradicted in other places by scripture itself. This is why we must always listen to scripture in its fullness, the complete counsel of God. So, this brings us to the end of our analysis on the early date of the Exodus. Just for the sake of review, this is our chart of evidence. I'm going to mark where the early date should have matched the evidence and did not. But here's where the evidence does intersect our date lines. I don't think I need to say much more, and I will leave the final verdict to you. If you like these videos, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you for watching, and see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.